going to go through extending the invitation, calling in. And we're going to begin with this idea of call out culture, which you may be familiar with it. If not, that's totally okay. I'm going to explain a way of understanding call out culture. It refers to this tendency for some individuals to publicly name instances or patterns of oppressive behavior or language used by others. Some really prominent examples are, it usually happens publicly, in which there are individuals, usually celebrities, that maybe say something or do something, and then there is a kind of like backlash that happens, right? And I'm naming it not necessarily it being good or bad. I'm just naming what happens, right? As from an observational standpoint. But that's kind of what call out culture refers to. And so when it says some individuals, it's typically a group of individuals, right? And sometimes when it happens in organizations, it's a group of individuals seeing something wrong, specifically around, it's usually not institutional. I don't think that's necessarily what we would call out culture. I think it's when someone, an individual says or does something or doesn't say something or doesn't do something. And then this kind of what we're going to describe happens. So people can be called out for statements and actions that are perceived to be sexist and racist, ableist, 2PC, and the list goes on. So there's just a lot of ways that this kind of ends up working itself out within organizations. And because calls tend to be public, they can enable a particularly like armchair and academic brand of activism, one in which calling out is seen as an end in and of itself. And what this looks like, I mean, we're seeing a real pushback against this, I think, especially in the last 6 months, but there was a time in which it was enough to just post the right thing on Instagram, or it was enough to make a Facebook post, an outrage. I'm outraged over this, right? But then the question became, what are you doing? You're calling this person out, but what are you doing to either contribute to the problem or contribute to the solution, right? It became this kind of like way of venting out frustration and anger that ended up not actually moving anything towards change. It just ended up being, you know, a ventilation system for actual outrage that was, I would say, warranted around systems that were not fair, and systems that are not fair, and actions that maybe were alignment with those systems that are unfair. So it ends up looking like lots of emails and reply alls and things like that, right? And the question becomes, what is this doing? Is this actually moving us towards what we want, or is it simply a way for us to vent our frustration and anger without actually moving towards change? And is it easier, and especially in a digital platform, to say something like this behind a screen than it is to actually have a conversation with someone, right? And what does that mean towards our systems, our understandings of how systems can change? So calling out can shut people down or stop behavior at the cost of creating opportunities for dialogue and learning. And I think the key is creating opportunities, invitations. It's not necessarily so that this would happen, but a calling out usually shuts things down. And so people who may be the recipients of being called out, it doesn't always provide opportunities for dialogue and learning for that person. Now, it's not always the responsibility of targeted folks to do that calling in and to create those spaces, right? But in general, when we're looking at growth mindset and human development, the goal of this model is to ask, okay, what does it look like for people to be able to grow and change? And if people can grow and change, what does it look like to create those opportunities for them to do that? Calling out typically does not create that opportunity for growth and change. Because if we call someone out and they are shamed and they move out of what they're doing, but not out of an understanding of why, or they don't change the perspective on it, they may end up doing it again in a different space, right? And so that's kind of the thinking there, right? And that doesn't always necessarily lead to the types of systems change that we want. So in the context of call out culture, it is easy to forget that the individual we are calling out is a human being. And in that sense, the different human beings in different social locations will be receptive to different strategies for learning and growing. Again, there's lots of caveats here. I understand that in seeing this, it may seem like, oh, it's everybody should get an opportunity to do whatever they want whenever they want. That's not what this model is saying in my understanding, but I will allow for those kind of questions to linger for the sake of the conversation today. One action becomes a reason to pass judgment on someone's entire being. and as if there's no difference between a community member or a friend and a random stranger walking down the street, who is of course someone's friend. And so I think what this is calling us towards is aspirational, right? It's what we aspire to kind of treat people as, right? How do we want to treat people? Um, Even when we disagree with them. Now that doesn't, there are again limitations to this around what kinds of disagreements constitute dehumanization and leading towards things like genocide. Like we can get into, that's not necessarily what this is talking about, right? But this is again just a model that we're using. So if we're not talking about calling out, right, what is the kind of alternative? And the alternative that we're going to be talking about is called calling in. The alternative to calling out is not to do nothing, right? That's not what this model is saying. It's not to just shut up and be silent and take whatever's happening, right? It's a practice of pulling folks back who have strayed from us. And it means extending to ourselves the reality that we will and do mess up, we stray, and there will always be a chance for us to return. And I think this is why cultural humility is so important. And a little bit, we haven't talked about cultural humility, but this idea of cultural humility is one of the ways that we think about. It's like, I don't know what I don't know. I will make mistakes. I am not perfect. I'm not perfect. I'm going to make a mistake. Now, this idea of strayed from us, who's the us? And that, I mean, we can get, that's a whole conversation to get into, but I think the idea that people are not perfect and people that will make mistakes, and that when we, people are going to mess up. We are going to, I am going to mess up. Let's make it personal, right? Justin is going to mess up. And so how do we create systems and create communities in which when I do mess up, when I do act outside of the values I want to uphold, where is there space for me to come back if I choose to come back? Now, that's kind of the key part, right? Is I have to want to choose to come back to the community. And the community has to have a set of values that are already in place. That's why I set up those facilitation assumptions, right? So that when you come into this space, oh, these are the values of this space. When you have values in other spaces, if people stray away from those, calling in can be a way of saying, hey, we this is our values as a group. This is who we say we want to be. We talked about that a little bit last time, right? Last week, creating that value set so that we can move towards being the community that we want to be, the true community we want to be. In this calling in, right? This is a way of saying, hey, this isn't who we want to be. We've said that, right? We've already established that. This is, so can we come back, come back to the center around the values, right? This is what that practice is about. So it's a practice of loving each other enough to allow each other to make mistakes. This pushes back against this idea that you have to be perfect in your journey towards understanding things like justice and equity, right? That you won't make mistakes. You won't say the wrong thing. You won't misgender someone. You won't use the wrong pronoun. It's saying that there may be moments where you do that. And it's not necessarily about the fact that you do that. It's about how do you make how do you move from that, right? In a call out culture, you get called out on it and you get publicly shamed. And I think the calling in model, where they say that if a person does something and they're willing to kind of think about it, think through it, right? They can be called in a way that says, hey, I'm not sure if you knew that you did this, but this is what's happening. One example I like to use of this for me is when someone did this for me is I was doing a talk, and it was a justice oriented talk, and it was all about race specifically. And afterwards, somebody came up and they happened to be a friend, and they said to me, hey, Justin, I just want to let you know that all the negative examples that you used in your talk were women. And I was like, no, that's not true. I would never do that. I'm wokety woke, right? And we talked about this last week, right? I'm wokety woke, right? And they said to me, no, actually, if you go back, they're all, and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't even see that I was doing this, right? As a male person, I didn't see that I was using all negative examples for women, right? Now, that person had just like posted about it on Twitter and like tried, that would have been one way of handling that situation. And I probably would have quote unquote learned a lesson. But by coming up to me and asking me, hey, can I share something about what you did? and then giving me a chance to kind of process that on an interpersonal one-to-one level, right? I have been able to learn from that, and now whenever I do anything, I'm always conscious of who I have as my examples, right? And that was an opportunity of learning and growing, because it wasn't based in shame. It was based in a growth, human development mindset. It's a practice of loving ourselves enough to know that what we're trying to do here is a radical unlearning of everything we have configured to believe is normal, right? The idea of shaming someone in the public square is a very, very old thing, right? And so asking, is this the best way to get the change that we want? It's a question, right? Not necessarily something that has an answer necessarily, but it's a question to ponder. Does this mean that we stand by silently when things are not okay? No, it's not what this is saying. It's saying how we do it matters, right? And if we want to do things differently, if we want different results, can we use the same systems of shame and public humiliation, right, that got us here? That's a question, right? Not necessarily one with it that I have an answer for. So, what is the difference between calling in and calling out, or how can we know some of the differences? Calling out is disempowering. It's debate and discussion based, which I think this happens a lot in the academy because we get told that the smartest idea wins, and that's not always the case, right? It's typically the most passionate idea that wins, but it still doesn't ask the question of, like, what does it mean to be across the table from another human being, right? You show up ready as an idea, not as a person, in that kind of framework. You push a point of view, and we talked about last time how that's kind of takes us back into pseudo community. It doesn't push us to the emptying phase, right? When we show up and we're trying to fix people and say, you know what, if they all did what I thought was right, then this wouldn't be happening, right? It doesn't come open to having a conversation. It comes ready to prove a point. A lot of times we frame conversations or town halls or anything like that around having conversation, but really what we're having are debates. Those are very different, right? And they're adversarial, and they're inherently antagonistic. What I mean by that is they're both people can't be right. There's either or. There's no space for the both and again, there are some things that I think elevate to a either or, right? But again, that's the process of moving through this, is discerning what those situations are. Another thing is insincere interest. It's when you come to a conversation or you come to a situation and you have no interest in hearing the other person's thoughts, but you act as though you do. You're listening only in terms of having a response for what they're going to say. Right? There is no active listening. There's not you listening and then pausing, letting what they said affect what you have to say, and then speaking. It's okay, let me see how I can. This is basically anything on Facebook that happens, right? You're basically only looking at their post in order to be able to pull some article from New York Times or Washington Post or wherever to refute what they just said, right? And it's just boom, 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 right? No one's really interested in hearing what the other person has to say, right? It's all about, let me prove you wrong and that I'm right. Doesn't mean that you're not wrong. I'm just saying it's about energy and how much energy you're expending in this, and is it actually getting you what you want? Is it actually moving you towards what you want? This also does not consider, calling out doesn't consider the target. It's not trauma informed. The irony is that in a lot of these call out situations is that the people who were targeted or who are the victims of whatever dynamic is happening don't get checked on, right? All the attention is focused on the person who did the thing, when there could be 7 or 8 people in the room who are victimized or targeted by the thing that was said or done. And they're just kind of left hanging, and everybody's focusing all their attention on them, and there's no care happening. And so those folks get further traumatized and further hurt. It's disconnecting, it's dehumanizing. It's also deficit based, right? It's not growth mindset based, and it's closing. It closes conversations. It says, you're out, you're done. Again, we're going to talk about at the end about this idea that perhaps there are times when people make choices repeatedly that have the impact of them not being able to be a part of a community. That's real, right? But what we're talking about is kind of a first stage, right? When we first come into situations in which we're having issues, right? A one way to approach it before that kind of happens at the end. So calling in is empowering, right? It's saying that we have the ability to have conversations and to talk to one another. It's affirming of the other person as opposed to having this debate discussion. It's saying, I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. It's sincere. in its desire to understand another perspective, not to agree with it, not to validate it, but to actually say, okay, why does this person think the way they think, as opposed to like they think this way because they're stupid. They think this way because of expletive, 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 right? That's a shift, right? And it doesn't mean you agree with it, but it's an attempt to understand why would they think that. There has to be some reason why, right? And then kind of trying to get in there. It's also about humanizing, right? And saying this is a human being that's had experiences and then grew up and that was a child and is someone's child and moved through life and has had trauma and has things that help create the situation that we're in here right now, right? They're not a monster, right? They are a human being that's gone through these experiences. It's also trauma and target informed, right? So when this thing happens, you're focusing not all the attention on the person who did the thing, but you're also looking at how did this affect other people in the room? And what might they be feeling? And how can that be helpful in addressing this with the person, right? Because sometimes when we're doing target, we're talking about your thing is racist. Those are ideologies, right? Those are ideas. But what is the impact of what this person just said on the people in the room? Oh, I felt, right? This is how I feel when that's state. Like that's different, right? That's humanizing, right? That's seeing impact not just in terms of ideology, but in terms of human connection with people that they know. So this is people that you know, you work with, or in relationship with. This is the impact that what you did had on me. And this goes back to what we talked about in the last session. Like once we can name that, then we can say, are we okay with that? I would hope that the person who did it would not be okay with that, right? And that there'd be empathy and compassion and human concern, right? Now there could be a sense of like, I don't care. And then we got to ask the question, like, is this the best community for you to be a part of? I mean, like, I'm not the one to say that that is, but that's a question that I think arises for me, right? Because if that's a value of the community and that person doesn't want to have that value, then they got to make a choice in that sense around how they choose to kind of deal with that. But it's connecting, it's asset based. It's saying that people bring things to the table that maybe we don't necessarily want to admit they bring, or that they're going through something on their own that's not about me, that's about them. Again, this is why the red, yellow, green is helpful, right? Because it allows us to see, oh, maybe what's happening isn't even about this meeting. Maybe they, back before COVID, they were dropping their kid off at school and they were late and they're just hot over that, or they got, cut off on the freeway or whatever. It may not even be about the thing happening in the room, but it's being expressed that way, right? But it just gives us more openness, right? More kind of openness around the idea that maybe it's not what we think it is. And that's kind of what that opening bit means. So I'm gonna give us an opportunity to take a breath because we're going through a lot of content. So I'm going to give us time to breathe, kind of let some of that settle before we move into choosing to call in or call out. So if you want to take it official, do the same thing we did at the beginning, right? Do some of those deep belly breaths, settle your body. I know there probably are 1,000 things running through your head right now, scenarios, possible things that you could use this for, times in which you wish it had been used, right? And so give yourself a minute to settle, and then jot down some of the situations or scenarios that are coming up for you in which you've seen these dynamics play out, or which you see this tool maybe being helpful moving forward, or both, right? But just take a minute right now. You can mute your screen if you don't want people looking at you, but just take a minute and jot down some reflections on what you think so far from what we've been talking about. So we'll do about 2 minutes of this. Okay, so we'll take those reflections and those thoughts into the breakout rooms for your conversations, and just keep those nearby for you. So choosing to call in and call out. So when we get to a situation, specifically in real time, there's a couple questions that we want to be asking. So who should do the calling in? When we think about calling in, we want to think about a number of different things, right? We talked last time about power differential. So if someone is a supervisor and they need to be called in, what does that look like for someone who works for them to do that versus a peer, a fellow supervisor to do that? Or if we're looking at demographic hierarchies, right? If you are in a targeted identity category, right? What does it look like for somebody who is in a identity position of power, historical position of power, right? to call someone in. So example, if there's something that happens around race, what does it look like for white allies to be the ones that do the calling in, as opposed to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color folks in the room to do the calling in, right? Because if you feel like you are the target of something, that may change your ability, your bandwidth to be able to do the calling in. Is the calling in target centered? So is it centered around, the needs of the people who may have been targeted by the thing that happened? And have you identified the appropriate balance between addressing the issue as an individual problem and as a systemic one, right? Sometimes individuals are products and reacting and moving out of the systems that they are a part of. And so if you feel as though someone is doing something that is racist, sexist, it's a sort of ask, is this because they have to do that to operate within the system? Is this because of their own belief system, right? There's kind of a discernment process that happens there. And that's sometimes hard to do. This is the big one. Do you have the time and emotional resources to engage in a dialogue? Oftentimes, especially when you feel like you're the target of a statement or something that happens, you feel your heart begin to race. You start to sweat a little bit. Your breath begins to shorten. You go into what's called fight or flight mode, right? When we go into that dysregulated nervous system state where we're in fight or flight mode, the science tells us that our IQs drop through the floor, right? And that's because all the blood, all the adrenaline, every part of your body is now focused on you surviving, right? It's the same mechanism that happened 100,000 years ago or thousands of years ago when there was a tiger in the tall grass and you heard it wrestling, right? There wasn't the people who said, I wonder if there's a tiger there, were eaten, right? And they didn't make it. So evolutionarily, right, the response is to act as if there's a tiger in the tall grass when you hear the reeds rustling, right? And then figure it out later. And so when our bodies feel threatened and our systems feel threatened, even if it's not a physical threat, our bodies respond as though it's a physical threat in that same, way of responding. And so in real time in a meeting or what have you, the question becomes, do I have the emotional resources to engage in a dialogue? Because when you're in fight or flight, it's really hard to have a dialogue, a conversation with someone. And so typically, if you were the one feeling targeted, you're probably not going to be in a good space to have a dialogue. And then, so maybe it's about waiting until later, right? When you can take your deep breaths, when you can get back to green, and you can be in a space where you can have a conversation as opposed to being in red, which turns into a fight. Now, are there times when fighting, quote unquote, fighting is maybe appropriate in the larger scale of things? I think yes, but what we're talking about is this interpersonal conversation space, right? And so then what are your desired outcomes? And are you comfortable stating them aloud? We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but what do you want from the conversation? Do you want the other person to think that you're right? Like, do you want things to change from a systems perspective, or do you want different outcomes? One way I like to think of this is impact versus intention, right? Sometimes we don't intend to do something and it has an impact on people. And so the desired outcome of doing something could be not necessarily changing the intention, right? I didn't intend to do this thing, but the desired outcome could be that I don't do this again, right? And that could be the desired outcome, or that could be the ask. Like, oh, I don't want you to change what happened. I want you to change how we do things moving forward in light of this. That's what I want. So you can name that and state that out loud before you begin. So this is going to be the fun part. You may want to take some notes on this. This is, I think, the most helpful part of this system is the script, because it gives us a way of addressing difficult conversations that as we begin to practice it, you won't need the script anymore. It'll just kind of become second nature. But it's appreciate, affirm, and invite. And these are three different things that are a three-step way of addressing issues that can be super helpful. And it can be done over email, it can be done in conversation. But as you begin to practice these scripts, you can begin to use them more frequently and adapt them and change them. But it's a great way of beginning the process of opening conversations. So the first one is appreciate. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure that wasn't easy to say, right? Now, the appreciation part is not about agreeing with the person, right? It's about appreciating their human move to share what they think, right? Um, Thank you for having the courage to share a different view, right? Because oftentimes when views are viewed as different in a space, it does take courage just to say that. So you can say that. And these are maybe things that I like to use because they're honest, right? If you can really say this with true honesty, then you can actually affirm the person, appreciate not affirm. You can appreciate the person's sharing something without appreciating without agreeing with what they said. Or you can say, I appreciate your honesty. These are all three things that you can begin this with, right? That show another human being that you see them, that you see what they're doing, that you kind of acknowledge their existence as a human being, not as like a machine or something like that, right? And so then the next one is affirm. I can see that this really matters to you, right? Because if a person is speaking up about something, then it must matter to them. And so naming that can help. I can understand you care deeply for our students. We have that in common. We may not have the same, right, way of changing things, but we do care about students. That's why we're here, right? Shared values, right? Bringing it back to shared values. I'm glad you are engaged in this dialogue, which isn't easy. Now the subtext there is I don't like what you said, or I don't agree with what you said, but I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're present. It's not easy, right? Beginning with that, right? And then the invitation, right? This is the key one. I would love to hear more about your perspective on this. Are you open to having a longer conversation? I would like to share my perspective. Are you open to hearing that right now? That third one is great, right? Because anytime we're in a situation, this can be super helpful because it allows us to save our energy, right? When you invite consent around a conversation, if somebody says yes, then they're asking for your thoughts. And if somebody says no, you keep it pushing, right? On some level, right? You don't have to keep trying to hey, let me talk to you. Let me talk to you. You don't have to do that, right? You can say, okay, this person doesn't want to hear what I have to say, so I'm not going to say it necessarily, right? And so this is just one way of kind of gauging that through the invitation. So appreciate, affirm, invite. Those are the three steps that are super helpful. And I'm going to give I've already given the PDF of the slides to Cyrus to give to you so that you can have this script for later. But you kind of craft your response around this first, as opposed to just diving into what you think about the thing that the person did, right? That's kind of the idea. And so how do we then create this call-in culture other than those three moves, right? We want to make sure that we stay responsible for our feelings. So noticing, am I red, yellow, or green right now, right? And just kind of keeping a constant temperature check of where we are, especially in meetings or in potential high temperature situations. If you have a smartwatch, sometimes you can set it to have like an alert when your BPMs go over, beats per minute, and your heart goes over a certain level. Like if you set it at like 90 or something like that, then anytime you're in a meeting, you're sitting still and it goes super high, then you'll know, it'll alert you. It'll say, hey, your heart rate's elevated. And that's your body telling you that you're feeling something, right? You're either angry or scared, or you're in that elevated state. So that's just one way you can kind of track that with before it even hits your conscious mind or conscious thought. Identify unconscious biases. So things that maybe you bring to the table that have you seeing people in certain ways that affects the way you feel about a situation. And also provide micro affirmation. So kind of throughout the workday and throughout the work week and throughout work life, giving people their props, giving people their flowers, right? Saying you did a great job here, right? This, that, right? That builds social capital that you can use, and goodwill that can be used in situations when the call-in is necessary, because you've already begun to develop a relationship, right? And build trust and capital with people on a social level. And then ask why 5 times. So again, this is getting into like, they said this thing, why? Well, because they're this. Well, why? Oh, maybe because this. Why? Well, I guess because that, right? And it gets you down to some root causes as opposed to looking solely at the surface level, right? And then we want to allow for mistakes to happen, because they do. And then also think about what makes your relationship with this person important. It may be solely because you work with them or for them, right? But that's an important relationship, right? It's a tendon in an organization, right? In the connective tissue of an organization. So if there are things that are wrong in those connections, right, the organization, the organism can't move as it needs to. um, and again, engage in dialogue, including kind of clarifying values and checking your own personal perception. So what are your values? What do you want to do moving forward? How do you want to show up in the space? What's your embodiment going to be? All right. So we're going to take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and do some scenario work, where you're going to practice these skills and these tools on some fake scenarios. And you can just see, how would you use these tools in order to respond to these, right? And these will help us reflect on how we respond to them in our real lives. So I invite you to turn your camera off, go mute, get some water, do whatever you need to do, and we'll be back and start up at 11:12. Okay, so 11:12 and go from there. All right.